the people that are doing it well are women and people of color, and that diversity begets diversity, and there's something there. So thank you for bringing that up. Amira.
Yeah, I think it's important to underscore that it's not about a lack of talent or personnel. It's about a lack of opportunities, an opportunity gap, not an achievement one that we're talking about here. And this is where I like to sprinkle historical context, because I feel like it's really helpful to understand that before Title IX, when we're talking about coaches of women's sports, we're talking about 90 to 95% of women collegiate sport coaches of women's team being women. Right, that number is now under 50% today. These are the unintended consequences, right, of Title IX. And this is why we have to have nuanced and critical views. Don't be afraid of the mess, jump in it and understand, right? Title IX can simultaneously have opened up doors and opportunities. But as Nikki said earlier, right, the fastest growing sports under Title IX are also the least diverse. I'll say that again, the fastest growing sports under Title IX are also the least diverse, right? And so there's a way in which the system and the institutions that we're operating within, it requires us to think big and think about those decision makers, because everything else is like playing with the tip of the iceberg and you're never actually moving it, right? Because the other thing to consider with it is, we talked about the number of SEC coaches last season was 7. To be clear, there was 6 across the rest of the Power 5 schools, right? That number is now 5, right? 3 departures, 1, that's the math that is hidden. It's very easy to be like, okay, they're still leading. They are. But we need to talk about retention, right? We need to talk about how finicky coaching positions are, because it's very easy for that math to go backwards, right? It's very easy to become a replacement instead of an additive equation. And I think the last thing that, I think about in terms of this kind of conversation is also to connect it to Shanice's point about inequity is Title IX, is not applied to the NCAA as an institution, right? There was a whole court case about that in the 90s. Despite their member institutions needing to abide by it, they do not have to. But it's helpful to understand and remember the history that there were other moments of possibilities. There were robust sporting histories before this. When you were talking about all the sports, I always start an assignment with my students talking about Tuskegee in the 1920s, who had just installed 10 tennis courts, half of them with lights so you could do night games, a golf course, a swimming pool, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So a lot of times understanding that there is a precedent for widespread sporting opportunities. There was a precedent for robust leadership positions of Black women in sports. But there was actually a process of running people out of the game, out of those positions. And so if we look at the moment in which the NCAA takes governorship over women's sports, we can actually see those possibilities being stamped out, right? Where other voices in the room were pushed to the sidelines, and an organization that sued multiple times to not have to do anything about women's sports suddenly is in charge of it. So we shouldn't be surprised about weight rooms, right? And this report I mentioned that just came out about gender inequity is not necessarily new, but it has a lot of receipts. And I think it's really helpful to understand that this is also about investment. This is the last point I make, but it's a really important one, so I have to say it, because you can't push for the same product, right, without an understanding. There was $35 million more invested in the men's postseason tournament. $35 million more. And when we're talking about inequity, we're not just talking about weight rooms. We're talking about access to higher quality COVID tests in the middle of a damn pandemic. Despite the fact that San Antonio, now I'm mad, despite the fact that San Antonio built a PCR testing center 2 miles from where the women were housed, they still had antigen tests, which resulted in like 5 times as many false positives that were taking people out of games, right? We're talking about corporate sponsors, food. Men had higher access to better quality food, not just because they had it catered, which was also true, but because they authorized their corporate sponsors, Pizza Hut, Buffalo Wild Wings, to provide meals. You can just do that too for women. Like it's just that simple, right? And so sometimes it's just like simple decisions. And you talk Coach Adams about like what that does to the psyche. Players know it's just a continuous process of reminding people that they are not deemed worthy enough for investment. And this is why I get mad. It's irritating, right? It's very irritating.